Hello and welcome to another edition of another book review. This week I'll be reviewing Revenge of the Tipping Point, Malcolm Gladwell's newest work. I did read this on audiobook, so I don't have a cover to share with you, unfortunately. I also just really quickly wanted to say at the beginning, I will briefly mention suicide and self-harm. So if those things are topics you want to avoid, please avoid this video. I'll just talk about them briefly because they are mentioned in this book, but wanted to give that heads up. I'll cover Malcolm Gladwell, talk about what this book is about, talk about what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it, who I'd recommend the book to, and finish off with what I'll be reading for next time. For those who aren't aware, Malcolm Gladwell is a very famous nonfiction writer. This book, The Tipping Point, is a look back at really his breakout book, which came out in roughly the year 2000, The Tipping Point, and it covers, in some ways, it's an inverse of that book, which I'll talk to you about in a little bit. If you're not aware of who Malcolm Gladwell is, I've reviewed a couple of his books on the channel before, The Bomber Mafia and Talking to Strangers. I'll leave those links below if you want to check those out there to learn more about him or to check the reviews for those books. Suffice it to say, he's a well-known nonfiction writer. He's often kind of trying to find the unconventional wisdom in things, or to find the hidden history of things. He has a very famous podcast, Revisionist History, where he kind of does this similar stuff. It's going back and kind of seeing, did we get that story wrong? Is there another side to that story? And things of that nature. This book is, in some ways, he talks about at the beginning of the book, a reflection on the original Tipping Point, which came out in roughly the year 2000, and is about how he wanted to go back and rewrite that book with new knowledge that we know today about some of those topics, He kind of abandons that and really instead talks about how epidemics and pandemics are kind of all around us. Since that time, and he really kind of goes into a dive into why do these things happen in terms of what are the conditions that need to happen for something to be kind of a pandemic or an epidemic. Most of the stories in the book, I'd say all the stories in the book, revolve around kind of negative things. And so in The Tipping Point, it was like, how did Hush Puppies go from this like relatively obscure brand in the 70s to being like the hottest streetwear in a relatively short time. This book is really about, bank robberies and Medicare fraud and the pandemic itself he covers, and then the opioid crisis. So he covers a lot of ground, but it is mostly, I would say, things that are relatively negative. There's a suicide crisis in a town that I think goes unnamed. He talks a little bit about that. So what did I like about the book? I really like the beginning of the book when he's talking about the bank robberies in Los Angeles. That's kind of the second thing that he talks about. He has this framing device where he starts talking about the opioid epidemic, and that kind of bookends the book. In the beginning, he talks briefly about that, and then he goes into bank robberies, and then he goes into Medicare fraud. And that first section to me was kind of the strongest part of the book. There's another part of the book where he talks about cheetahs. And so those three sections to me were the highlights. It's very, very classic Malcolm Gladwell. He does a very good job of really giving you, the bank robbery section especially, I didn't realize there was something of a slew of bank robberies in Los Angeles in the early 1990s, and he has really interesting detail to make you feel like really tied to what he's talking about and the characters that were involved in this thing and the brazenness in which these bank robbers were robbing for some cases hundreds of thousands of dollars. And part of that is to talk about, well, why did this happen in Los Angeles and not other places? And he has this concept of what he calls the overstory, which is essentially societal conditions that you may not be aware of, but nonetheless cause unintended consequences, usually years down the road. And so that's a concept that kind of comes up again and again in the book. In the case of the pandemic, he talks about the overstory of triplicate prescribing. So essentially how stringent each state was in terms of keeping records of doctors prescribing painkillers, pain medication to their patients. And this started, I think, in the 1940s in California, and he kind of goes over the history of that and how some states signed on for this and some states didn't, and that really reflects today during the opioid epidemics which states were the hardest hit. And I thought that was really interesting. He also talked about the cheetah population and how cheetahs' immunization systems are really heavily weakened because they are so incestuous over since the Ice Age, and I thought that was also, the writing there was actually also really, really strong. And that part of it, in my opinion, was kind of tied to a weaker part of the book, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but that balanced out really well because the cheetah writing of it I thought was really, really strong. And then he kind of has this concept of the thirds, which is basically saying if you're trying to change culture or change the overstory or change a ratio of things, the concept of one third is really important because you have essentially a status quo. And I'm oversimplifying, obviously, but if you have a status quo and something else happens to bring that number above one third, the counter group or counter narrative or counter understanding or whatever it may be, once you pass the one third mark, it tends to, in some situations, radically alter the culture or the system that you're talking about. And he kind of talks about racial segregation and white flight in the 1950s and 60s in California. And he kind of talks about this planned development where the residents were they're multiracial, and they had basically covenants to only sell to people of their own race in order to kind of keep these ratios set, so to limit the white flight. And I thought that was kind of interesting. There's some parts in the book, to get to the negative, there's some parts of the book, and Malcolm Gladwell has been accused of this before, of kind of taking evidence that applies to one thing and kind of broadly applying it to a bunch of other things. And I think the 33% may be one of those things. And he talks about, there's a group experiment to show this 33% and how important it is in order to change people's minds to really try to capture over a third. And at that point, it becomes much more of a common thing. So there's some issues with the book. Like I said, I think as the book went along, I got less and less interested. There's a part where he talks about gay marriage and the change in the acceptance of gay marriage, and he kind of points to Will and Grace being really important to that. He kind of leaves out Ellen DeGeneres and Ellen DeGeneres' role in that in a way that I think he probably could have tied those two things together relatively easily, and I thought that was kind of strange. To me, that was much more of a larger part of that story, was having her come out in Time magazine and being a real person who's out, and how that impacted the culture as well. He doesn't really talk on that. I've just accepted at this point there's probably going to be one thing every Malcolm Gladwell book that's going to irk me. And the opioid epidemic part of it didn't irk me as much. I thought that was relatively well researched. And you may be upset about it because he in some ways lets the Sackler family off the hook and their actions, and he doesn't really dive deeper into their actions during this whole thing. He basically says, the company engaged in these practices where they, paid doctors, or, paid is not really maybe the right word, but wined and dined doctors in order to have the doctors continue to prescribe these pills. And he doesn't really go beyond that in terms of, well, what did the Sacklers know and what were they doing? Did they realize they're acting unethically? Who was paying the salespeople and all those things? And so you may be asking yourself, why was there a reluctance to go like one layer deeper? He comes up to implying that maybe wining and dining went beyond wining and dining into maybe some other illegal or illicit activities, and he doesn't really go into that very, very deeply. So I was a little frustrated by that, but overall what he said to me made sense, and it was also kind of fit in with his story of the unintended consequences, where in the Sackler family or Purdue Pharma switching from a time-release capsule they could be crushed to one where they couldn't crush and snort the time-release, the pill, it basically shifted those users to using harder drugs like fentanyl and heroin, and that also caused a lot of deaths and destruction from that decision. The rise of fentanyl and if these people would have used fentanyl anyway, it's a large counterfactual, but that's there. The one part of it that I think did irk me the most was, and I will say nothing in this book irked me as much as talking to strangers, so that was nice. It wasn't quite that bad. I do remember really being upset by that book and frustrated by what I thought were just really intellectually not as stringent as I would have liked to of examining certain things. And I think this book for the most part, he kind of is at least fun. Like the Medicare fraud section to me was fun, and kind of looking at Miami and their overstory, and kind of the idea, the image of Malcolm Gladwell going to this this office building that's basically a labyrinth because it has all these fake fronts in it. I thought that was really, really fun. So there are fun parts of the book. Most of them are front loaded, in my opinion. I think the book does get weaker as it goes on. The biggest one to me was he talks about college admissions, and I don't want to make this too long. I've covered a college admissions scandal book in the past. I think Guilty by Admissions is the book. I'll leave that link below if you want to check that out. But he uses the college admissions thing. He frames this by talking about Harvard specifically, and the Harvard women's rugby team, and through a series of looking at the past of Harvard and the affirmative action cases against Harvard and other colleges, he basically comes to the conclusion that athletics is a form of affirmative action for white people by a different name. He conflates, whiteness and wealth in a way that he kind of gets away with. He also talks about the women's rugby team, where they're from, and most of them seem to be foreign-born players, so they're not even Americans, a lot of them. And I felt that the answer when people are asked about, well, why do we have, and I guess to go forward, Harvard has an admissions process where about 2/3 of them get in through probably what we would normally think of as normal recruiting practices. So, you have a standardized test, you have your GPA, you send that in, you either get in or you don't. I think they do force people to do admissions essays, but that's kind of the normal process for that. And he compares the Harvard process to Caltech. He says Caltech has about 40% of their students are Asian. They have a very much more meritocratic system that is based just solely on grades and just solely on test scores. And so you either get in or you don't. And he thinks that Harvard would be much more like Caltech if they did it that way. And I don't know the curriculum of Caltech versus Harvard, but assuming that it's the same, he points to the major difference being this third of seats. So there's like 1/3 of seats that are held aside, and you can basically get a bonus or a tip if you're in one of these groups. And those groups are legacies, so your parents or grandparents went to the school, athletes, children of faculty, so if your dad was a professor, you get a tip, so you may get like a bonus or a consideration because your father was or your mother was a faculty. And then dean's list. So the dean basically says, we are going to admit this student. As you can imagine, being on the dean's list is usually associated with your parents or grandparents writing a check. So these are all 18-year-olds, so that's always something to keep in mind when we talk about the monies. Usually it's coming from the parents or the grandparents. And he basically says, for the athletes, because of the sports that Harvard has, like women's rugby, they tend to be very expensive. And he points to a Georgetown tennis player, and she spent like $50,000. She was also the top-ranked tennis player in Maryland. And so she spent all this gobs of money that her parents put into her tennis playing ability when she was in high school, which allowed her to go to Georgetown and play there. And he basically says, why do we have this system? And like I said, athletes are just one of the four categories. He doesn't go after legacies, which I thought was really strange, because to me that's the obvious one. And maybe you could argue which one of these four is most objectionable. I don't know anybody who's ever said legacies was the least objectionable in terms of merit, but he strangely kind of ignores the legacies. He ignores the faculty and ignores the dean's list. And his argument is basically this is dean's list plus steps. And he doesn't seem to have a problem with the dean's list, but he has a problem with the athletes. The athletes make about 10% of the incoming class. So first of all, you're not talking about proportionally a huge number of people. This is more than the other schools. Typically, if you go to a public school, it's probably closer to 2 to 5% of your student body were recruited as varsity athletes. So it is larger. And then the question is, well, why does Harvard do this? And the answer he comes to is this is basically affirmative action through a different name, and allows them to keep these ratios, these racialized ratios. Again, it doesn't really talk about, is it a racial issue or is it a money issue? And he just says it's them doing the racialized issue to keep the Asian students out. It's essentially what he implies. What bothered me about it is he goes into the history of anti-Semitism at Harvard, which is a real and sad history, tragic that they did this. But what they did in the 1920s was it was more of a meritocratic-based system, and then they have basically likability and personal essays and interviews in order to screen out the undesirables, in this case, Asian students. Now, again, in the case in the 1920s, Jewish students. Now, again, his argument is that athletes are there to help the white students. The Supreme Court just had a case. They had a case last year. Maybe it was 2022, where they, depending on how you read the reading, either gutted affirmative action or severely curtailed affirmative action. I'm not going to get into my own opinions on that because it's kind of irrelevant. But the way that Harvard was found to, and they were found to have done this, it's not like a hypothetical, theoretical. The judges of the Supreme Court, the highest court that we have, found them to have engaged in racial discrimination. And the way that they did that was through what they did in the 1920s to the Jewish students. They basically said, hey, there's a likability score, this is a subjective score, and we're going to score Asian students lower than other groups. And there is a statistical variation that we can do and basically show through that and through email records of the admissions officers that they are racializing this group of people. They're not treating them as people, and they're penalizing them essentially for being Asian. Now, again, Gladwell's point is they're doing this to keep the white students where the white students are, and to keep the ratios the way they are. The second group that got the lowest likability scores were white students. And so there is a question of like, well, if you're really trying to put your thumb on the scale and really trying to drive your numbers up for the white people, you probably would give them more tips than the black or Hispanic students. And he doesn't really touch on that. He basically doesn't have any, I would say, like real hard evidence to show that this is what Harvard is doing, that there is a racialized component to adding sports to the calendar that maybe not everybody plays. You then get into like, well, we're talking about 10% of the students, they're athletes. How many of those are football? How many of those are baseball? How many of those are football? Which sports would be the normal sports, and which sports are the non-normal sports? And the other part of it is, I keep going through down this thing, but there's like almost no consideration for any of these things, and it kind of drove me nuts. Why would Harvard do this? And it cost them all this time and all this money to do. Is it possible that because of News and World Report rankings that they're in competition with everybody else? Well, yes, in fact, that is the reason they're doing this. And that student who Malcolm Gladwell would say is like the student we should be aiming for, the student who gets perfect A's, 1,600 on the SAT, can go to any school he wants. Well, why would he go to Harvard and not Caltech? He may be a sports fan. That may be part of it. It may be that he is someone who's very future focused, because you would be if you are a Harvard student. You probably had to delay a lot of gratification to get into Harvard, to take those, to do the extra studying, to take the test and do the thing, to get the other thing. But you may be someone who is future focused even at like 20 years old. So you're probably thinking about, do I want to have a family? What does that look like? Because Harvard offers legacy admissions, it may be very beneficial for me to have two of that child's parents go to Harvard. So why would you then want athletes? Well, athletes are typically very healthy people who, because they're required to strenuously train for their sport, tend to be very fit. And that may be attractive to some people. So that's part of it too. And to me, it's part of like, what is the college experience? Well, athletics and athletes have been part of Harvard's experience since probably 100 years, 150 years. So there is a tradition there, and he kind of poo-poos the tradition, doesn't consider it. You can buy it or you can not buy it. But the onus to me would be on Gladwell to say, are we saying this is true for all sports? Should we get rid of all college sports? Well, if we were going to get rid of all college sports through this argument that it's not really conducive to academic success, why would we start with the Ivy League schools and not like the publicly funded schools at universities? And I know Gladwell in the past has been on Intelligence Squares to talk about football and how college football is probably not something that should continue for a few reasons. And I actually was pretty persuaded by that. And he had a theory of just like licensing the name out. So to anybody who wanted to join the team, they didn't necessarily have to be college students. I thought that was interesting. And he doesn't get into that, the health aspects of it here. But to me, it was a strange place to start. And I think what bothered me is like, there's a hypothetical. This could hypothetically be true. And you probably would need more research to show if this is actually what Harvard is doing. I don't think that's necessarily what they're doing. It probably is a byproduct of what they're doing. But there are things the athletes bring to the campus. He doesn't really consider them. They are attractors to other people. He doesn't really consider that. To me, it's part of the broader college experience. If Harvard didn't offer athletics, then they would be competing with other sports schools that did. And so it's a Red Queen style reason that they offer athletics. He doesn't consider it from that prism. And I think if he considers it from that prism, it makes a lot more sense. Yeah, I'll leave it there. If you either buy the argument or you don't. If you buy the argument that athletics are important for college sports, then you then have to say, well, is Harvard a private business? Are they allowed to do what they want, or are they not allowed to do what they want? And if Harvard is a private business and they're allowed to do what they want, then they're the Ferrari dealership. And if you go to the Ferrari dealership and you say, hey, I would like to buy a Ferrari, and they're like, well, it's $500,000. And you go, well, I have $100,000. They're legally allowed to tell you, no, then you can't buy the Ferrari. What they're legally not allowed to do is tell you, well, it's $500 if you're one race, and it's $700,000 if you're another race. They're legally not allowed to do that. It's essentially what Harvard was found guilty of. So it irked me because at the end of it, he goes, well, surely we can agree that one of these things is more insidious than the others. And I'm like, no, man, racial-based discrimination is always going to be more insidious than price discrimination. And then you get into the argument of, well, what obligations does Harvard have? And is there a different set of obligations for Harvard than there is for a public university? And I'd argue there is. Are they held to different levels of scrutiny? I argue there is. Is it up to society to, in my opinion, wean itself of this obsession with the Ivy Leagues? I would argue that it is. But that's deeper than he really wants to go. And I felt that whole chapter, I think, could have used another set of eyes or another way of looking at things. And he covers the Abigail Fisher case and has the arguments from the Abigail Fisher case. He doesn't go into why the Abigail Fisher case was a case at all. He doesn't go into how UT's admission system is different than Harvard's admission system. Doesn't go into that. And I realized he was tight for space, and I get that. But then, there's a whole case. The Supreme Court just had a case, Malcolm. Like, you're not going to cover any of that. There's no audio from that at all that directly ties to your argument because you're talking about Harvard. So I was irked by that. And the other thing I would just say, if the argument is they should have fewer athletes on their campus, okay, well then how do you choose what is the right number of athletes that Harvard should have on its campus? And if your argument is that we just don't want to have tips for them, are we doing that for all schools? Are we saying that there should be no scholarship athletes at any school? If not, why not? And why would you hold a private organization higher standard than a public university? Those are real things that I was just irked when I was reading this. And I think I feel like I have sympathy for the devil. I'm not a huge Harvard fan, but I just read this and I just was like, I don't know why the animus is here. It's not on legacy admissions, which is where the animus usually is for these four groups. Usually legacy has the most animus. And I just didn't get it. It was just like one of those things where I'm just going to be on another side with Malcolm and just kind of scratching my head. That's the book. That was my biggest rant of the book. Overall, I enjoyed the book. The first half, I think, was better than the second half. He has a section about a suicide epidemic in some city that was relatively well-to-do, like a Lake Wobegon, where there were a bunch of high school students who killed themselves. And the reason he says is because there's no diversity in terms of their ambition. And he's talked about suicide epidemics in the past, and that really wasn't the reason for those suicides. And so I thought that chapter was kind of like, that can't really be the reason. And I found that to be a little strange. He pairs it with this chapter on cheetahs, which is about cheetah diversity and how cheetahs' immune systems are basically ravaged because they're all basically the products of incest. And I thought that was an interesting pairing, and I think he kind of gets away with one to where most people are probably not going to dive too deeply into those two things. He kind of gets away with that, I think, a little bit. And I was just kind of questioning that too, where it's like, that really can't be the reason for the suicide epidemic, is because all these kids are super ambitious. Like, that just makes no sense. Then why is that different every other place? Anyway, but I've gone on too long on this video. I enjoyed it for the most part. There's some chapters I had problems with. I really liked the first half of the book. To me, it was like the old Malcolm Gladwell is back, and he's telling me cool stories about things I didn't know about. And then as the book went on, it was stuff that I had read about before. And that was, to me, less interesting because usually I have additional information just on other things. And I think he has a tendency to want to find another side of the story. And sometimes that works, and sometimes that has him doing things where it doesn't really make a ton of sense, or it opens up a lot of other questioning of why that is the correct side of the story. And then finally, I think that the college admissions things irked me because it was like the one time in the book he tries to be political and says, "Well, surely we all can agree on this one thing," and it's just like, no, not even this. But if you like Malcolm Gladwell, you're going to like the book. You may have more problems with it. I haven't read any reviews yet. I saw on Goodreads it got relatively strong reviews so far. There's a review of it I want to read soon, but I haven't had a chance. I usually try to save reading for reviews till after I've read the thing. But if you liked anything else from Malcolm Gladwell that you've read, I think you'll like this too. To me, it's like the perfect airport read. The audiobook is quite good. The interstitial music is good. I have no complaints about the audiobook. It moves pretty well. It's really well produced, and the audio clips that he gets and uses are really nice to underscore his points. I think there's a little bit fewer of them than he's used in the past, but I would recommend the audiobook if you are going to read this. Yeah, next time I don't know what I'm going to read, so if you have read this book, I know it just came out relatively recently, but if you got a chance to read it and had different thoughts, please let me know below. Until next time, bye.